So I'm going to be talking about extinction, which, as Mara pointed out, I've been working on in recent books. One might think that the answer to extinction is conservation. So what I'm going to do in my presentation today is explore contemporary conservation efforts. And I'm going to argue essentially that conservation, or at least the mainstream of conservation, is a form of capitalist climate governance, which mobilizes precisely the kinds of forms of humanity or denials of humanity that Claire was describing, right? In other words, where humanity gets associated with the sovereign, property-owning subject of the kind of settler colonial imaginary. So how do these distributions of the human and these denials of the human play out in the contemporary moment is essentially what I'm interested in exploring. So let me start. As you know, no doubt, we're living through an age of epic plant and animal slaughter. In its 2020 Living Planet report, the World Wildlife Fund for Nature reports a 68% average decline in numbers of birds, amphibians, mammals, fish, and reptiles just since 1970. This sixth extinction wave is characterized by what scientists term extirpation, or the extinction of both specific animal species and entire populations on a local and regional scale. Worse still, this biodiversity crisis is affecting not just animals, but also other forms of life, including insects, plants, and fungi. A 2020 report from the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, for instance, stated that some 40% of the world's plant species are now threatened with extinction. And it's not just specific species of animals, plants, and fungi that are being annihilated. We're also witnessing dramatic declines in the abundance of local species across all taxonomic groups, although some groups and geographic regions are more intensely affected than others. The scale of annihilation of the planet's life forms is so immense that it has become a primary driver of global environmental change in its own right. So how should these shocking statistics about extinction and biodiversity life be interpreted? Who's responsible for extinction, and who's most imperiled by it? Who, conversely, maintains biodiversity, and who is culpable for its extirpation? It's not enough, in other words, to simply register the sheer fact of the sixth extinction. It also matters how one interprets this crisis and what policies get accepted as the appropriate response. The dominant tendency, I would argue, has been to blame an undifferentiated humanity. As many critics have argued, this is the import of the now well-known term, the Anthropocene, which attributes the massive environmental changes undergone by the planet in recent centuries to an undifferentiated or homogeneous humanity. The term conveniently obscures the fact that only a small segment of humanity is responsible for the vast majority of environmental impacts, and that a specific economic and political system, capitalism, is driving this wave of annihilation. So hence the Capitalocene and the other terms that Claire talked about. A similar obfuscatory lens has been applied to the biodiversity crisis. For example, in her best-selling book, The Sixth Extinction, journalist Elizabeth Kolbert writes, "As soon as humans started using signs and symbols to represent the natural world, they pushed beyond the limits of the world. If you want to think about why humans are so dangerous to other species, you can picture a poacher in Africa carrying an AK-47, or a logger in the Amazon gripping an axe, or better still, you can picture yourself holding a book on your lap." Kolbert rather bizarrely seems to attribute extinction to writing, or more generally to the human capacity to represent things using language. It is this representational capacity, she argues, that is the root of our ability as a species to reorder the world. This argument leads her to spread blame to the point where responsibility becomes almost meaningless. She writes, for instance, that this representational capacity predates modernity, but that modernity is its greatest expression. Yet rates of extinction are obviously not identical across history, nor are they the same from one place to another. In addition, although Cogut points the finger of blame at people reading her book. Before doing so, she names the usual suspects: poachers in Africa and loggers in the Amazon, without providing any context for why people in these places might engage in such behavior. Her suggestion that small-scale hunters and subsistence farmers are responsible for the sixth extinction is a bit of disproven Western ideology that should be seen as thoroughly racist. Colbert's accusation tacitly legitimates the violence meted out to people represented as poachers in parks around the world. This kind of ahistorical analysis essentially places a bullseye on the backs of many people in the global south by suggesting that there is an inherent antagonism between people and nature, and that it is people in the global south specifically who are imperiling nature. Spurred by this idea that people in general must be kept separate from wildlife if biodiversity is to be preserved, big conservation organizations are ramping up what critics call fortress conservation. This long dominant approach to conservation involves setting up increasing numbers of national parks, wilderness areas, nature reserves, and similar enclosed territories, all of which conservation organizations tend to call protected areas, or PAs. I'll be calling them PAs from now on. With the intensification of the extinction crisis, the conservation industry has thrown its effort to enclose more land into overdrive. According to the historian Mark Dowie, for instance, the total area of land now under conservation protection worldwide has doubled since 1990, when the World Parks Commission set a goal of protecting 10% of the planet's surface. This goal has been dramatically surpassed. According to the 2020 Protected Planet Report, at least 17% of terrestrial and inland water and 10% of coastal and marine areas are conserved. If this territory were contiguous, it would be an area larger than the Russian Federation. A stunning amount of land, in other words. For conservation organizations, this is a great success, but as we will see, there's a plan to roughly double this enclosed land because of the worsening extinction crisis. And I want to argue that this amounts to a new form of colonialism. As the conservation industry encloses more and more of the lands collectively owned by indigenous people, peasants, and pastoralists around the world, the dispossessed are increasingly rising up in opposition. Their cry is decolonize conservation. This talk explores the context for the campaign to decolonize conservation. I begin with a definition of so-called nature-based solutions and an explanation of the broader biocapitalist regime of accumulation, of which they are a part. I then turn to a more detailed discussion of the conservation industry and their plans for coping with the conjoined climate and extinction crises. And finally, after surveying and critiquing such dominant approaches to conservation, I close the presentation with a discussion of the alternatives proposed by the movement to decolonize conservation. Okay, so first of all, biocapitalism. The term nature-based solutions made its debut in a 2009 document written by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN. I'll talk more about the IUCN in section 2, but for now, just note that they first brought this term nature-based solutions into circulation in 2009, and it was part of the UN climate negotiations conference in 2009. This timing makes it clear that global elites were becoming aware not just of the increasingly dire material impact of climate chaos, but also of an increasingly strong movement for climate justice around the world. 2009 was the Copenhagen conference, and there was a huge amount of mobilization by the climate justice movement at the conference and in its wake. Elites clearly felt they needed to be seen to be responding somehow to the intertwined threats of climate and political crisis and shifting away from strategies of pure climate denial. Their answer, fake green capitalist fixes like nature-based solutions. So what exactly are nature-based solutions? According to the IUCN, quote, nature-based solutions are actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural and modified ecosystems in ways that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively to provide both human well-being and biodiversity benefits. They are underpinned by benefits that flow from healthy ecosystems and target major challenges like climate change, disaster risk reduction, food and water security, and health, and are critical to economic development, close quote. This definition clearly reflects a shift in the core doctrines of capitalism, with nature no longer being viewed simply as what economists called an externality, something to be ignored at best or used as a dump for the products of industry. Economic systems are now seen as nestled within a natural world that must be sustainably stewarded. If this is done correctly, according to the Iucn, nature can provide benefits to both humans and biodiversity. And conveniently, it can also address some of the environmental crises produced by a system hell-bent on frenetic growth. So the Iucn's definition was part of a broader shift, I would argue, in capitalism, something that, if you know about the Stern report, for instance, which was from 2006, mobilizes similar kinds of ideas about kind of green capitalism. Notice that the Iucn's statement concerning nature-based solutions concludes with an assertion that all of this must help to further economic development, or more bluntly put, the continued functioning of the capitalist system. Like the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, which is more recently drafted, of course, and the recently published British report entitled The Economics of Biodiversity, that's from last year, nature-based solutions are defined by a core contradiction: an effort to cease degrading the environment and to achieve harmony with nature, and simultaneously and impossibly, a call to continue global growth rates of 3% in order to achieve human development objectives. So, one might think that the Stern report from 2006 had been sort of disqualified by continuing environmental crisis, but the Economics of Biodiversity report from last year remobilized a lot of the terms deployed by Stern and describe biodiversity conservation as a form of asset management. Biodiversity loss is presented as a simple asset misallocation, which can be fixed without impeding economic growth, right? So for the economics of biodiversity, there are three basic core elements to consider. One is capital, one is human capital, and one is natural capital. And the idea is that you can sustain and grow all of those in tandem. Yet, as researchers such as Jason Hickel have shown, a global growth rate of 3% or more will render it empirically infeasible to achieve reductions in aggregate global resource use and to reduce CO2 emissions rapidly enough to stay within the carbon budget to limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius, not even to talk about 1.5. These various efforts to financialize nature should be seen as part of a broader regime of biocapitalist accumulation. I follow Stefan Helmreich here in defining biocapitalism as a novel kind of capital that arises when the substances and promises of biological materials, particularly stem cells and genomes, are increasingly inserted into projects of product making and profit seeking. Biocapitalism includes efforts to patent life on a molecular scale that date back several decades, but which have been significantly intensified in recent years with the invention of new and increasingly efficient forms of gene editing like CRISPR. The efforts to continue capital accumulation through nature-based solutions that unfold on a planetary scale must, I would suggest, be seen as another facet of recent biocapitalist innovations designed to financialize nature. As we will see, however, biocapitalism must also be seen as a form of necropolitics, since it involves depriving a significant segment of humanity of the conditions necessary for social reproduction. The production of certain forms of life thus also requires the systematic production of mass death. Despite its carefully crafted image as the key means for saving the planet, biocapitalism is engaged in what could be termed accumulation by extinction. Notwithstanding the looming environmental breakdown, contemporary capitalists are doing everything they can to continue accumulating wealth. Indeed, capital accumulation is speeding up and intensifying in the teeth of the environmental crisis. According to the United Nations, for instance, the global material footprint rose from 73.2 billion metric tons in 2010 to 85.8 billion in 2017 before the pandemic. That's an increase of nearly 18%. And of course, it's come roaring back as the pandemic has abated somewhat. While ramping up production and consumption, capitalists also seek to invest in sites around the world that are likely to absorb not just overaccumulated capital, but also waste products of production, such as greenhouse gases. So this is what the conservation industry is increasingly specializing in. It sets aside protected areas that are supposed to conserve nature and not coincidentally to absorb carbon emissions, allowing the capitalist system to carry on at full tilt. In the process, it consigns certain people to categories not just outside humanity, but also outside the charmed circle of wild animals and plants to be saved for posterity. So what exactly is the conservation industry? No organization better exemplifies the conservation industry than the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which I already alluded to. Founded in 1948, the IUCN is a network of more than 1,000 environmental, scientific, and governmental organizations that compiles and publishes the well-known Red List of Endangered Species. The importance of the IUCN in the world of conservation can hardly be overstated. It has consultative status with the United Nations and strong links to many governmental and non-governmental organizations, as well as with many businesses. Indeed, as Bram Buscher and Robert Fletcher explain in their book, The Conservation Revolution, the IUCN exemplifies what has become known as corporate conservation, or as I call it, the conservation industry. Buscher and Fletcher describe the IUCN as, quote, an increasingly dense and self-referential network that binds together three key sets of powerful interests. First, big non-governmental organizations, sometimes called bingos, like Conservation International, the Nature Conservancy, World Wildlife Fund, and the Wildlife Conservation Society. Second, intergovernmental financial institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund that have been key to promoting neoliberal paradigms around the world over the last half-century. And last, prominent business partners coordinated within the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And I recommend Andreas Malm and the Zetkin Collective's White Skin, Black Fuel for a history of capitalist climate governance that talks in detail about the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. This powerful network is a problem since it means that nominally conservation-oriented organizations like the WWF collaborate with some of the most environmentally destructive capitalist corporations in the world. Indeed, they actually share some of the same staff. In Buscher and Fletcher's words, conservation has become, quote, more intensely and overtly capitalist in its goals, expressions, imaginations, and ways of operating, close quote. And conversely, the IUCN's incestuous network of powerful business interests and conservation organizations also means that conservation has become increasingly important to global capitalism. The IUCN conference in Marseille last autumn was particularly consequential. The meeting generated a document called the Marseille Manifesto that embodies the priorities of the organization and its many affiliates. At the outset, the manifesto recognizes that the climate and biodiversity emergencies are not distinct, but two aspects of one crisis. Unsustainable human activity continues to compound the situation and threatens not only our own survival, but the foundation of life on Earth. So that's a quote. Although the IUCN's recognition of the interrelated character of the climate and biodiversity emergencies is no doubt a positive thing, the manifesto reproduces exactly the same generalizing understanding of the factors driving the emergency that I have noted characterizes the idea of the Anthropocene, as well as of liberal takes on the extinction crisis, such as that of the journalist Elizabeth Kolbert. The Marseille Manifesto does get specific in one particular area, its urgent call for the expansion of protected areas around the globe. The document states that, quote, the Congress implores governments to set ambitious protected area and other effective area-based conservation measure targets by calling for at least 30% of the planet to be protected by 2030. The IUCN here clearly adopts the media-friendly 30 by 30 slogan, 30% of the planet by 2030, a demand that was also taken up by the working group drafting a post-2020 global biodiversity framework for the Convention on Biological Diversity. The 30 by 30 plan, in other words, this is a very consequential document. The 30 by 30 plan is derived from the work of renowned biologist E.O. Wilson, whose headline-grabbing Half-Earth Manifesto from 2016 argued for a massive expansion of protected areas around the world. In 2017, influenced by Wilson's arguments, a group of scientists published a paper laying out a plan for what they called a global deal for nature as a companion to the Paris climate deal. They argued that their plan would, quote, promote increased habitat protection and restoration, national and eco-regional scale conservation strategies, and the empowerment of indigenous peoples to protect their sovereign lands. Like the Global Deal for Nature, the IUCN argues that its 30 by 30 plan must, quote, boost the agency of indigenous peoples and local communities and reduce biodiversity loss at scale, close quote. It's not surprising that the IUCN and other official organizations are making these kinds of gestures towards inclusion, democracy, and the empowerment of indigenous peoples. Adoption of the 30 by 30 goal is likely to have a really significant impact on indigenous people and other land-dependent communities. A scientific analysis of the impact of E.O. Wilson's Half-Earth proposal published in Nature in 2019 concluded that at least 1 billion people live in places that would be protected if the Half-Earth proposal were implemented within all regions. A subsequent analysis by Rainforest Foundation using the same data concluded that meeting the 30 by 30 target accepted by the Conference of Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, and also at the UN Climate Conference, by the way, last autumn in Glasgow, quote, could directly displace and dispossess 300 million people, with many more being indirectly affected, close quote. The magnitude of possible dispossession and displacement implied by these conservation goals leads the authors of the Rainforest Foundation report to state that, quote, while we recognize the importance of conserved areas for the future of life on Earth, we urge advocates of Half-Earth, 30 by 30, Global Deal for Nature, and similar ambitious area-based conservation targets to consider important broader issues, such as environmental justice, the multiple values people attribute to nature, and the need for action to tackle the ultimate economic consumption and production drivers of biodiversity loss, close quote. And this issue is also a live one for socialists. I have not yet read it, but Verso is about to bring out a book called Half-Earth Socialism. So, you know, debates among socialists about these goals are likely to be very lively in coming years. Okay, so the last section of my paper, Decolonizing Conservation. Given the shocking magnitude of these proposed policies, it should not be particularly surprising that some indigenous groups and their allies have denounced the 30 by 30 target as neocolonial. While big conservation organizations carefully promise to align conservation activities with human rights and with community and participatory-based approaches, none of the proposals that aim to make conservation appear more people-friendly have gotten to the core issue of who controls land in protected areas, or who decides whether a location is decided to be protected and what that means. And of course, these questions open onto others. Who decides what places are declared protected areas? Who gets to say whether customary lands are recognized when such decisions are made or not? Since none of these questions are adequately answered or even generally acknowledged by genuine mainstream conservation organizations, the declaration of protected areas may be seen as nothing but another land grab, one whose scope is truly breathtaking. And of course, also builds on colonial and racist roots. Conservation goes back not just to the expulsion of Native Americans from places like Yellowstone, but also to sweeping forms of dispossession, for instance, when the British Forestry Service was set up so that Adivasis were ejected from their land en masse. Preserving biological diversity may be important, but conservation policies based on the precepts of the Western wilderness movement, including the belief that all human intervention is bad for the retention of biodiversity, i.e. that wilderness is a human-free zone, and that wilderness areas should be should be as large as possible, is devastating. This ideology has resulted in the construction of massive wildlife sanctuaries throughout the global South, in which there is, quote, a total ban on human ingress in core areas of national parks. And that's from a conservation organization, that quote. But human in this instance refers to local or indigenous inhabitants, since in many, if not most cases, one of the main reasons for these parks' existence is to attract the patronage of wealthy Western tourists, right? So you can kind of see how that category of the human is slippery and gets redeployed in ways that are not necessarily beneficial. As I explain at greater length in my forthcoming book, Environmentalism from Below, these paradigms of fortress conservation that constitutively exclude indigenous peoples and other local forest-dependent communities spread around the world during the colonial era and even intensified in many post-colonial nations. But these policies did not go uncontested. Powerful mobilizations among indigenous and traditional peoples in the 1970s and 80s challenged the exclusionary foundations of conservation. Political movements asserted the primacy of their customary rights to land over the disposition carried out by states. And this is really key, right? If you know about the history of nation states and not just colonialism, but even post-colonial nation states, customary land rights were systematically ignored, elided, and this goes back to what Claire was talking about in terms of the kind of constitution of the human. In turn, some Global South nations initiated reforms to recognize customary rights legally, which also necessarily involved rethinking fortress conservation. For example, Brazil's post-authoritarian constitution of 1988 recognized the rights of indigenous peoples to their traditional lands, recognition which opened the way for formal titling of large areas of the Brazilian Amazon to customary rights holders. On an international level, political campaigns led to the recognition of customary rights of indigenous peoples to lands, territories, and resources, as well as to the restitution of lands taken from them without prior informed consent. The struggle for the recognition of these rights featured prominently in negotiations that led to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was formally adopted in 2007. In other words, more or less the same time that nature-based solutions were being formulated. Probably not a coincidence. Studies produced in this period revealed that 50% or more of protected areas had been set up on land traditionally used or occupied by indigenous peoples, although, of course, in the Americas, 100% of protected areas are in indigenous land. And it's not for nothing that in the same period, delegates at an international indigenous mapping conference signed a declaration stating that conservation has become the #1 threat to indigenous territories. The fight of indigenous people and land-dependent communities for recognition and rights that produced these various changes are reflected to a certain extent in the Iucn's Marseille Manifesto, so the kind of gesturing towards indigenous empowerment. But nonetheless, the language of the world's most powerful conservation organizations and those kinds of changes in that language they're hard-won victories, but most reforms of protected area legislation are focused on enabling co-management of reserves, or on making provisions for communities that already own land to include their territory in national protected area systems. There is not a single country where protected area laws recognize community land ownership, and this is kind of the key thing. So in my presentation, so I'll say this again, there's not a single country where protected area laws recognize community land ownership. States around the world still arrogate the right to land, and this means that the kind of capitalist climate governance schemes that I've been detailing are able to consistently mobilize forms of dispossession, particularly in the global south, where elites the rulers of states are quite willing to take over land that is communally owned under duress from international financial institutions and the what I've been calling the conservation industry. This material fact vitiates much of the rhetorical respect for the rights of indigenous people that has been evident in recent documents. So I want to close by talking about the movement that is challenging all of this. At the same time that the Iucn was meeting in September last year, a group of indigenous peoples and their allies also met for a counter summit and produced a document called the People's Manifesto for the Future of Conservation, which argues that the only just, sustainable, and real solutions to biodiversity and climate crises lie with humanity. This is their language. Lie with humanity, in particular with indigenous peoples and local communities who are the best guardians of biodiversity, and with a model of conservation that puts human rights and human diversity at its center. Dominant models of conservation, those fostered by the conservation industry, only give lip service to community inclusion, the People's Manifesto argues, and remain dominated by a model that is far from being rights-based. According to the manifesto, reforms such as people-centered conservation are only cosmetic and only include indigenous and local people as an afterthought. The indigenous people and organizations who gathered to author the People's Manifesto argue that genuine conservation would involve not just recognizing the environmental stewardship of indigenous peoples and local communities. Decolonial conservation would also fight against the real causes of environmental destruction, the overconsumption and exploitation of resources led by the global north and its corporations. So in this respect, the People's Manifesto echoes the Cochabamba Declaration of 2010 by arguing that preventing planetary ecocide means challenging contemporary forms of green capitalism in the world's core imperial nations. To rein in such green capitalism, social movements in both the global north and south must insist on the necessity of dismantling unnecessary polluting sectors of production and consumption that are currently integral to the economic and social models of wealthy capitalist nations. In tandem with this struggle for alternative forms of prosperity, activists also must resist efforts to solve the biodiversity crisis by shifting the burden onto the backs of the world's poor through nature-based solutions and other false responses to the crisis that allow powerful corporations and their government stooges to carry on with business as usual. And in this paper, I hope I've given you a snapshot of how these nature-based solutions are playing out and what these kind of green capitalist strategies are. Most basically, this means that governments must fully respect indigenous peoples' lands and forest rights, including their collective customary land and forest use. So there must be a total cessation in the construction of all protected areas that exclude indigenous and local communities, and no such protected areas must be constructed in the future without full, free, prior, and informed consent of the people on whose customary lands such protected areas will be situated. And of course, these ideas are guaranteed in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but it's important to note that they're not being respected and to mobilize to push for them once again. Linked to these indictments of dominant models of conservation today is an insistence in the People's Manifesto for Conservation that governments and big conservation organizations acknowledge the toll that fortress conservation has taken historically, and equally importantly, make concrete plans for reparations, including land back. The People's Manifesto thus connects the call for decolonial conservation to a global demand for the restitution of land rights. This restitution of land rights to indigenous people and local communities must take place in virtually all the nations of the world. Movements can strengthen their work in particular national context by placing their demands within the context of global solidarity. Thus, for instance, a recent call to return national parks to Native American tribes in the US by the author David Troyer in an article in the Atlantic needs to be seen as paralleling developments such as the Forest Rights Restoration Act in India or the sweeping restitution courts have approved in Indonesia. So just to give you a tiny sense of how this movement really is kicking off in lots of different national contexts. This is a global movement, and people fighting in particular places need to be in solidarity with one another to a greater extent, I would argue. And of course, we have documents like the Red Nations Red Deal to kind of orient these struggles, as well as some of the other documents that I've alluded to. The People's Manifesto closes with a set of demands that lay the groundwork for a decolonized conservation that is simultaneously anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist by calling on rich countries to provide the financial resources necessary to fund land-back efforts in the global south. Of course, there have been calls for reparations for quite some time, including in the Cochabamba Accord. I think this call for use of funds to help land-back efforts is a really important concrete call. Billions of people around the world are responsible for conserving biodiversity. All too often they have been and still are marginalized and persecuted by dominant forms of conservation, as I've tried to show. As many cultural critics have pointed out, racial capitalism has long functioned by casting those it wishes to exploit as subhuman, non-human, or through an assimilation to the category of the animal and thus devaluing them. Yet, as I have shown in this presentation, the conservation industry tends to grant greater rights to animals and plants than to a significant portion of humanity. While the conservation industry laments the sixth extinction and takes steps to preserve life in protected areas, indigenous and local communities are consigned to a space of mass death. In this sense, the forms of eco-fascism, of which writers like Andreas Malm and the Iucn Collective have warned us recently in White Skin, Black Fuel, are fostered through these zones of conservation and eviction in the global south. But in the face of these forces, indigenous people and local communities are not only steadfastly protecting the planet's biodiversity, but are also rising up to fight against new forms of colonialism. Thank you so much for giving me the space to help articulate the call to decolonize conservation.